Welcome everyone. How's it going? How's it going? This is the Conscious Chicano. Welcome to Conscious Chat number 33. And the title is The Consequences of Systemic Sin. Yeah, I want to talk about this. Um, so, lately, I've been getting into conversations about systemic white supremacy, colonialism, and all that. And a lot of times, Christians are not aware of systemic sin. And a lot of times they're in denial of systemic racism, systemic white supremacy. They deny colonialism, and and you got cases where you have European descendants on indigenous stolen land, and they claim that they don't they don't owe anything to the natives, and a lot of times they say, well, it's they didn't do what their ancestors did, so they're guilt free, right? Their hands are clean. That's what they like to do. And some of the worst ones are the Christian white. A lot of times it's European descendants who are Christians. Those are some of the worst ones because they'll use the Bible to say, hey, you have to forgive me, right? You have to forgive me for the atrocities of my ancestors, right? Of what they did to, you know, brown people's ancestors, right? Or either they say, oh, I don't have no white guilt, right? Why should I be guilt? Why should I have white guilt? You know, they say that, or we're winners of war, right? Um, and they like to say that, I didn't do any of that stuff, so why should I be held accountable for what other white people did on this continent? And so this is this video is the result of that kind of discussion, and I want to confront this head on, especially amongst European Christians and even some of you people of color who are out or who are confused by white supremacy and Eurocentrism. You buy into this white republicanism, and they confuse you and make you believe racism doesn't exist, systemic racism doesn't exist, that you shouldn't have no white people shouldn't have white guilt, none of this stuff. And it's only about economics, right? I've seen a lot of this stuff happening in the Christian community, and I'm confronting it head on. And it needs to be addressed in the church. And a lot of these times, these Christians come out and say that any talk about racism and white supremacy is not biblical, right? It's not biblical. That's just nonsense right there. The Bible's full of social justice. Even Jesus confronted the racism of his time, right? The systems of his time, the corruption of his time. And there are systems in place that are corrupt, right? That oppress people. And we saw Jesus confronting that kind of system, especially the economic system, the religious system of his time, the government, systemic government at that time. And examples is that Jesus addressed the economic, materialistic mindset at that time, where it was all about having money and being rich, and you could care less for the poor, right? You know, he confronted that whole issue. the economics of that time. He even said it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, right? And there's a lot of other situations where Christ revealed the economic injustice and countered it with his wisdom and his actions, right? The same thing with racism, where it was forbidden by certain. There was Jews at that time that didn't want to didn't want anything to do with Gentiles in some sense. They saw them as goyim, or even they saw the Samaritans as like half breeds, and that they had like a view that they were inferior, right? So Jesus actually countered that racism and actually ministered to Samaritans, Gentiles, right? Healed them, ministered to them, fed them, right? They were in the crowds amongst the Jews. It wasn't just the Jews only, it was the Gentiles as well. Even the whole government at that time was oppressive. Okay, so we have a culture that was corrupt, that Jesus confronted. We had an economic system that was corrupt. Jesus toppling the tables. He saw what they were doing in the temple, just trying to make money and disrespecting the temple of God at that time. So he turned the tables over, right? He saw what was going on, you know. And Jesus talked about greed and materialism a lot of times in its corruption. Total rich man to give all his possessions if he wants to be made perfect, right? And the rich man walked away disappointed, and he because Jesus saw that this man, you know he he did he was basically, in his heart, it was all about material wealth, in some sense. And even the government at that time, Jesus dealt with a corrupt government, the Roman Empire at that time. Paul did as well, you know. And there was times with the disciples, they said they rather obey God than man, right? When the government officials, you know, mandated that they stop preaching the gospel, right? So that's an example that government's corrupt, right? God is above government, God's laws, right? Man is corrupt. Government consists of men, corrupt men, right? Jesus even um, countered the officials who were basically accusing him of different things, and Jesus countered that with his wisdom and truth. And there was the religious officials in government authority, as well as the secular Romans as well. So Jesus confronted, and so did the disciples, the corrupt systems of his time. The book of Revelations talks about the system of things, right? The corrupt beast, the system, right? Corrupt governments, right? The system of things, right? And so we have to think about these systems, these corrupt systems that are put into place, right? And even the whole, systems oppress people, right? It's the way things are, the way it functions, right? It oppresses the have-nots, right? You either the have or the have-nots, right? We saw that even all the way back in Jesus' time, right? And then we have the concept of sin, right? Sin has corrupted man from the beginning, right? Since Adam and Eve sinned and brought sin into the world, right? and man was corrupted from that, right? And his nature, right? So we have corruption. And sin is not just individual, it's systemic, right? And when I talk about systemic, it's like aggregates of sin. It's groups of people that set up systems that come from the nature of sin. There's a case actually sin pervades all of the world, right? All of reality in some sense, right? And when people establish and erect certain systems, there's sin within it, right? And these systems oppress others, right? So it's important to understand what systemic sin is, right? And it still exists to this very day, right? And as we've seen, even Christians are guilty of perpetrating this system of sin, especially the religious Pharisaic type system of sin, right? Embedded with Eurocentrism, white supremacy, Eurocentric theologies, right? Certain laws of the past, right? The doctrine of discovery. I would suggest if anyone's interested in terms of systemic sin and native people, brown people, get a book by Mark Charles. He's a native Christian. It's called Unsettling Truths. He's really good on revealing the system, colonial system of sin that was brought over here from Europe to the Americas, and how this system of colonialism has oppressed native people throughout these throughout the Americas, right? That includes you Chicanos and Mexicans as well, natives, right? And ever since colonialism, get another book called American Holocaust by David E. Stannard. It goes into all the atrocities of Europeans and what they did in the Americas, right? And they call themselves Christians. In my belief, I don't think they were real Christians, because if you were Christ-like and following Christ, you wouldn't have been doing none of that genocide and slavery, land theft, right? And so this legacy still exists to this very day. And there's consequences to this systemic sin. It didn't disappear out of nowhere, right? There's consequences to sin. Now we got these white Christians out here saying, well, I asked for forgiveness. I shouldn't be held accountable, right? Oh, I didn't do this sin. So it was my ancestors, but I didn't do it. So I'm clean. Yeah. You don't hold me accountable, right? And so Mark Charles actually gave it a good example, saying that it's interesting that, he had a European person in his audience who was listening to his lecture about what has occurred, in terms of colonialism in the white church. And he talked about the genocide, the land theft, the slavery, all this stuff that was going on, and the church was complicit with it. They went along with it or didn't say anything about it, right? Or they justified it with their white supremacist theologies, right? So this European Christian actually was in the audience, and I guess he talked to Mark Charles and says, "You know what? Can you forgive me?" And it's like Mark Charles made the point where, okay, this guy is gonna ask for forgiveness, right? But he's gonna go back home, basically live in his white picket fence with his nice family, making all this income and money, right? While the natives go back to their reservations that are, at times like ghettos, and going, natives on the reservation is They go through harsh conditions, right? And so this is the problem with a lot of white Christians out here. They feel that oh, I could just ask for forgiveness and there's no consequences, right? And my understanding of sin, there are earthly consequences to sin. Now Jesus will forgive you, right? God doesn't see your sin, but there's earthly consequences, right? Just like someone commits a crime here on earth, right? Say someone commits an act of murder, right? And so the justice here on earth is that they go to prison, right, for life, or they get the death penalty, right? That's the natural consequences here on earth, right? Now, if this murderer goes and asks for forgiveness, right, goes and asks the family for forgiveness and asks God for forgiveness, definitely God will forgive him. I'm not too sure if the family would. Maybe some will if they're Christian, right? But there's still consequences to his actions, right? He still has to pay for what happened, right? He has to be in prison or he gets the death penalty. He has to live with that for the rest of his life, taking another person's life, right? And he did damage. He did damage to the family, right? That person's no longer here, right? And so I just like to talk about the consequences of systemic sin, aka systemic white supremacy. And this systemic sin has, ever since the Europeans came to these lands, what did they do actually? They claimed they were Christian, right? Which again, I say they weren't. Many weren't. Maybe some were who were righteous and truly follow Christ and God, but I would say most of them were hypocrites. Most of them, they did not know Jesus because they were coming in this land murdering, raping, stealing land. you know they exterminated a lot of natives and put them on a reservation of land where land that wasn't really useful, right? Starved them to death, beat them to death. You could think of the worst atrocities ever in humanity. Natives went through one of actually the worst Holocaust in history. You hear about the Jewish Holocaust, right? But the indigenous Holocaust well surpasses the indigenous Holocaust, the brown Holocaust. Well, it surpasses all the other Holocausts that you can even think of and combine them together. The indigenous Holocaust is the worst Holocaust in human history. And guess what, Chicanos and Mexicans, you're part of that. You are descendants of indigenous people. And you understand why most of your people are low income. Most of them are poor. Most of them are working for European descendants and building their empire, right? Most of you are cooks, right? Or some of you are cooks. Some of you are farm workers, right? Um, you know, and a lot of our people are not as wealthy as those of European descendants. And so they like to pull tricks on you, right? Europeans. They'll come out and say, "Oh, well, we have hey, wait, we got some blacks and some browns who are rich, right?" That's their little technology. They use tokenism, right, to say that they're not racist, right? That racism doesn't exist. Or white people like to play the victim of reverse racism when in fact you're trying to remedy past injustices done to brown and black and native people, right? For example, affirmative action. A lot of white people oppose that, right? But how long did white people have affirmative action? Natural affirmative action, white privilege. It's still happening to this very day. We see cases of a lot of white people getting into Ivy Leagues due to their uh, white privilege, right? There's even some controversies where they got caught paying off, certain with admission officers and everything, in order to get in these Ivy League universities, right? This happens all the time. And guess who has most of the money? European people usually have this money. Now, they'll always throw a monkey wrench at you and try to say, well, there's some black people and there's some brown people who are rich and this and that. Exceptions don't make the rule, right? And there's actually another good book called Settlers. And if you actually listen to that, white people have never been the permanent underclass. The permanent underclass has always been brown, black, and native, right? Even when you have some white people who are poor, they still have that white privilege where, a lot of times they choose to be lazy and homeless, right? And on drugs, right? In fact, a lot of brown people have to work even extra harder to even gain any status in a white supremacist controlled society, right? And a lot of them will say, "Well, where's white supremacy? I don't see no no was it no signs that say oh white only and this and that." No, it's not about explicit racism nowadays. The civil rights era, people think the civil rights era ended white supremacy, and it didn't. They think Barack Obama being the first black president ended white supremacy. It didn't. And we see a lot of the inequalities that exist in society. We see the majority of people in the prison population are brown, right? We see the racism towards brown immigrants, right? The inequalities, job discrimination, stuff like that that's happening, right? You know, there's a lot of that occurring. And just think about it. Even me speaking a European language, that's due to systemic white supremacy. I should be speaking my native language, but they made it a requirement to function in their language, right? In order to communicate, to get an education, to work, and all that. So we can even say these institutions that were established in the Americas have embedded in it Eurocentrism and white supremacy, their educational system, their government, their politics, their economics. I could get into the economics, how capitalism has benefited ever since the inception. Capitalism came out of slavery, black slavery and native slavery. And white people profited off the land, the stolen land. They created their economic system that benefited them. Later on, brown and black had to fight against the discrimination and racism of this system and to try to get equal access to opportunities. And it took a very long time to even get little crumbs, right? Now, with the little crumbs that we get, white people are crying reverse racism, right? Or they come out and say there's no such thing as racism. Oh, there's no such thing as white, right? But we all know who are European descendants, right, on this continent, right? They call each other white, right? They categorize, they label themselves as white most of the time, right? And I'm not talking about exceptions. I'm talking about the majority. You can always try to throw a monkey wrench at me in my arguments, And say, oh, no, no, that's not true. That's not true. No, I'm talking about majority of times what's going on out here. So we need to address this systemic sin, aka white supremacy. And people think white supremacy is just individual, right? Some kind of skinhead or KKK or some racist guy just calling you a name or whatever. No, systemic white supremacy goes beyond that. It does involve that, but it's more, it's the system of things hits you harder. It hits people of color harder in terms of economics, discrimination, social status. We can go into different fields of how white supremacy affects people of color. There's actually a guy named Neely Fuller Jr. who talks about all this, how white supremacy affects people of color. And I go even beyond that and says how it has affected people, native and brown people since colonization. If you actually think of all the systems that were brought here by the Europeans and established, you got their economic system, right? That works in favor of Europeans, right? And I'm not talking no token exceptionalism, right? And you just look around, just drive around. I'm out here in California. Most of the poor communities are brown and black, right? You go to the rich, wealthy communities, the upper middle class communities, guess what? They're usually European people right there. You got a few tokens there, right? You got some token brown people and black. And I'm not saying they're sellouts, but matter of fact, brown people deserve more than what they actually have, right? They deserve the resources and wealth of this land. So the question is not whether white people are poor, middle class, or rich here. It's just their whole existence on this continent is problematic, and it raises questions because I actually heard a Native American man say, "You white people have to really think about your status on this stolen land. You cry about there's inequality for you, and there's reverse racism, and that some of you are poor and this and that. Just think about the land that you're standing on. You know, your motherland is Europe. Just remember that, right? You came and invaded these lands and you murdered women and children and elders, had them lynched, skinned, scalped, enslaved. And then you claim to be Christians and you took their land, right? Now you're crying about your status on stolen land and resources, right? Sure, sure. And I'm supposed to sympathize with that. No, I don't sympathize as an indigenous brown man. You should be sympathizing with our causes, right? Our plight, right? So again, my challenge to the white church out here, there's consequences to your systemic sin of what your ancestors did. There's a legacy. You say that, oh, why should I pay for my father's sin, right? Why should I, right? Well, guess what? Systemic sin still is happening to this very day. You see the native people and what they're going through. Their land is being stolen by this white government, right? Native women are being murdered and raped by European men that live around the reservations, right? Look at the boarding schools. What happened to them? Lots of children were murdered, beaten, starved, and all that. They were forced to cut their hair and forbidden to speak their native language and practice their traditions, right? The missions, the same thing, the Christian missions, the Catholic Church and all them, the Protestants. Some say the Spaniards are worse than the Anglos. No, they're both pretty bad, right? They both had this Eurocentric white supremacist agenda, exterminating, raping, murdering, taking stolen land, right? Then they have kids, right? And they pass that those stolen resources down to their kids, right? Now their kids could say, "Oh, well, hey, I didn't do any of that. I inherited the wealth, but I didn't steal the land. I didn't murder or nothing like that." This is what white people have done right here, and they have the nerve to go on native reservations and go speak to a native elder and confront him and say that, "Oh, why should I be held responsible for what my ancestors did to your ancestors?" You have the nerve to even say such a thing. You have no conviction, and you even claim, "Oh, why should I be guilty? I don't have white guilt," right? It's because your consciousness has been seared, as the Bible says. You have no consciousness, you have no heart, right? And a lot of you Christians are hypocrites because the Bible talks about justice, right? There is a concept of justice in the Bible, both in the Old and New Testament, right? That's right. Even Jesus told someone, to go even further, you know, if you have injured somebody, not to go even further, and give them, um, you give them more than what they actually need, right? There's plenty of examples of justice in the Bible, but we got a problem with some of these Christians out here that say that, oh, the Bible doesn't talk about white supremacy, right? Right? It does talk about justice, right? If you're truly a follower of Christ, you would sympathize what happened to the natives here, what happened to the brown people, and you'll realize what has occurred and what is still happening. It's not just in the past, right? It's still happening to this very day. We have the consequences of systemic sin. What are the consequences, right? Look at the condition of natives throughout the Americas. Look at the condition of brown people throughout the Americas. Look at the condition of black people in the Americas, right? They have been victims of colonialism and systemic sin, you know? And I'm not preaching any victimness, right? I'm not saying to stay a victim. I do believe you have to, rise above your victimhood. But at the same time, the victimizers need to come to grips to what they've done and what they have maintained. And the consequences of this is that we see people of color have been oppressed throughout history and to this, and the past affects the present, right? Economic injustice, institutional racism and discrimination, lack of equality has affected people of color, right? That's the consequence right there. We have lots of dysfunctional colonialism. Colonialism has affected Native and Brown people so much, and this explains a lot. It can be traced back to colonialism. A lot of the fatherlessness comes from the rape of Spaniards. That became a tradition, right? Even amongst the Native culture, there's a lot of fatherlessness. Is because a lot of Anglo males were raping Native women too, right? We can name a lot of dysfunctions, drunkenness, right? That came from colonialism. The Europeans would enslave natives and beat them down and overwork them, even in their agricultural system where they wouldn't even make money or hardly any. And what would happen? They would give them the alcohol, right? So they can escape their pain, right? And they would purposely get them drunk. I studied a lot of anthropology and culture and history. You guys can't pull a fool, you can't pull a fast one on me. I know the facts. I know what you guys did and the consequences of colonialism. You brought about confusion with your historical rape of Native women. Now we have some Mexicans who are confused about their identity and they don't want to be indigenous, right? They have this mestizaje mindset that they're both oppressed and oppressor, right? They're confused, right? And a lot of times they're ashamed of even being indigenous. They'll rather be European, dye their hair blonde, put some contact lenses, right? Try to look white, right? We have this racism embedded in our culture due to colonialism, right? So we have both internal white supremacy and external white supremacy, right? And look at the whole economic situation. We have a caste system that was established in Mexico as well as the United States when they first set up their whole economic system right here. You know, it favored those who were European descent, right? They were the ones profiting from the wealth, right? They had slaves, native and black slaves, right? They got Mexicans to work in the mines, native Mexicans, all of them working in the mines, all either for no money or hardly anything, and they would die and their health would be destroyed, right? But they would accumulate all this gold and minerals and wealth and everything. Just think about land is prosperity, right? After they stole all the land, right? They built their empire, they established their governments, their universities, their real estate, right? They profited from this, right? All this food and agriculture, farming, all this stuff, man. Just drive around. You'll see that most people who own these lands are not Mexicans. Even ownership, even when you own your own home, guess who ultimately owns all this land? The government, right? Who's the government usually ran by? Usually of European descent. You do have some people of color in government, but usually people who are running the whole show are European descent. I made the argument just look at Congress. Most of them are of European descent. You got a few tokens there, sellouts. You know, they claim they're progressive, right? But we just see the consequences. We have a political system that doesn't represent natives and Chicanos. It's not into their interests. We have a government the same way. We have an economic system. Oh, they say this is a free market, right? Anyone can make it, right? And pull themselves from their bootstraps. But certain people have more advantages than others, right? And guess what? There's a history of that. When you're discriminated for a very long time, you're blocked from having access to economic equality. When your educational system doesn't teach you like who you really are and your real history, and it takes money at times, you know, and your institutions, your educational systems discriminated against you in the past, right? There's a lot of systemic discrimination that happened in the past. It was not only with Jim Crow laws and all this stuff, but it was also financial and economic and knowledge too, right? You can't even teach ethnic studies at times. They oppose that, right? They oppose critical race theory. They want you to just teach a watered down white version of history. They don't want you to talk about the native, what Europeans did to natives, all the atrocities, right? Because you're going to find out what they've done in history, right? They don't want you to teach about what happened to the black slaves, right? They don't want you to learn about what happened with, what they did to the Mexican people in the Southwest, the lynchings, right? Stealing their land too, right? They don't want no ethnic studies in the educational system. That's a system of white supremacy right there. Neely Fuller says white supremacy has affected people of color in many areas. He talks about in politics. I just mentioned that. Politics, the government, economics, right? The media. Look at the media. It's run usually by European descendants, right? Hollywood. Look at racist Hollywood. They usually depict Mexicans as either a cholo or a drug dealer or prostitute, or they even make indigenous racist stereotypes of indigenous people, right? And usually people at the forefront of the media is usually of European descendants, and or you see people who are usually not even brown. Like you would think there's more brown people in Los Angeles around Hollywood, and you hardly see any of them in film and the media, right? You see mostly other people. That's just right there, even white supremacy, discrimination, even in terms of the media, right? And even our voice is rarely heard, right? All you hear about is just about immigration, right? Which is a just cause, right? But but you don't hear other perspectives, other other issues that brown people go through, right? And like I said, white supremacy has affected us in many ways, politically, economically, institutionally, right? Even in terms of war. That's what Neely Fuller Jr. says that. Talk about the military industrial complex, right? Recruits brown and black people, right? They've done that ever since they set up their military. They first brought their military and murdered all these natives, right? Then they have a nerve to name some of the helicopters, Apache helicopters, right? And they use native code talkers for their imperialism, their invasion, their white supremacy, right? They use brown and black for their imperialism and white supremacy. They've been doing it since the Buffalo Soldiers, the Indian Scouts, right? They love to use people of color to conquer others, right? That's white supremacy. They control the. Malcolm X talked about that. Why do you have even like he was talking about Africa? He says, why do you have few white people in control of so many black people? It's a system, and it's a Euro. They know how to control your minds and brainwash you, and they know how to do it systemically too. Once they set up their institutions, their systems, right? This is how they control you, and it's a caste system. They set up their caste system, and they find ways to filter people out. So the higher you get, the more you have their mindset, their Eurocentric mindset, and you follow their interests, right? That's usually the case, right? So we have this system of white supremacy that affects us in terms of government, politics, economics, war, right? Even religion, right? The fact that we have these Christians, whether they're white or non-white, and they buy into this white Republican Eurocentric thinking, and when a brown brother like me, who may be Christian too as well, or a native person, and we start talking about white supremacy, colonialism, critical race theory, oh, we can't have none of that. No, that's not Christian. That's not biblical, right? Or, but yet, you could promote your doctrine of discovery, right? You could promote your white supremacist theologies, right? You could tell native people, hey, you can't drum, you can't have long hair, you can't speak your language, right? You tell Mexicans, you brainwash Chicanos out here to oppose other Mexicans crossing the border, right? You even vent your racism towards immigrants, right? When the Bible says to have hospitality to the foreigner, right? You guys are a bunch of hypocrites. The white churches, they're a bunch of hypocrites. And some of you tokens out here that support this, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites too. And so the consequence of sins is the conditions, current conditions, the history of, is related to the present. The consequences of systemic sin, the sins of the Europeans that came to these lands, their atrocities, their whole colonial way of life and system, what they actually set up, their caste system in terms of economics, social status, wealth, right? The consequences is that we have the have and have nots. And so we have usually people of color who've been through a lot and they're still going through a lot. Poverty, right? We have the prison pipeline, you know. We have a lot of people of color in prisons. That's where slavery continued, right? It went from being openly an institution to now it's okay, it's justifiable. Now we can have slavery in the prison systems, right? Still exists to this very day, right? That's right, man. So white supremacy exists as long as Europeans are on this land and they have their institutions and they're controlling most of it. They have the resources, the wealth, the land. Guess what? You guys are settlers. You're colonists, right? You're on stolen land, right? And you benefit from the sins of your forefathers. And you establish a system of sin that continues the sin of your forefathers, where you benefit from it. You have privilege. You benefit from it. And most of the brown and black people, and I'm not talking about tokens because they love tokens, because they want tokens, they want exceptions so they can point out and say that racism doesn't exist, that there's no such thing, that we don't oppress people no more. It's, that's the thing of the past and that we remedied everything. That's just a deception. That's a lie. So exceptions don't count. Exceptions don't make the rule, right? That's right. Exceptions do not make the rule. If you study sociology, right? You take some Chicano studies, right? Take some Native American studies. Study about colonialism, systems of oppression, right? Study the legacy of the church in colonialism. It's racism. The past affects the present, right? The church has never confronted their racism. They were involved in colonialism, genocide. They justified a lot of that. They went along with it, right? You had different denominations that mistreated people of color. I was actually looking into even the Chicano Pentecostal movement. And back when the Pentecostal movement first started, there was racism. You had these white Pentecostals who were segregating and mistreating people of color. They didn't want them around, right? Seymour, I think it was William Seymour, who was a black Pentecostal. He had to deal with that too. and God used them mightily, right? And Mexicans were involved in that too. The early Pentecostal movement, they faced racism too. They were discriminated by white Pentecostals, right? And they couldn't. There's a whole history of that, and it's just not the Pentecostal movement. It was other denominations, other, you know, both Protestant and Catholic. Racism. The church has a legacy of that. It's due to the colonists, and their white supremacist interpretations of the Bible. And never have they have addressed any of this history. And they want to sweep it under the rug, right? And say, hey, don't talk about that. That's not biblical. That's not Christian. That's just a lie. That's just a lie. That's just to their convenience. But if you believe in biblical justice, biblical social justice, it exists in scriptures, then you're going to sympathize. And you're going to sympathize with the indigenous cause, the Chicano cause, the black cause. You're gonna talk about this and address these issues. And you're not gonna have the cockiness and say, well, hey, I shouldn't have white guilt. I didn't do that. My ancestors did, but I'm not guilty of it. Come on, man. Really? You're gonna have that attitude? Just go study what happened to the native people, the worst genocide in history. Go study all the lynchings of Mexicans in the Southwest. Come on, man. Just study eugenics in the United States. So-called founding fathers were a bunch of racist slave masters. Some of them claim to be Christians, which I doubt. So we need to address these facts here and stop buying into this white supremacist patriotism. The denial of racism, the denial of systemic oppression, systemic inequalities. Let's stop denying this and own up to it, address it, confront it, and make a change. Let's talk about it. Let's take action. This work to dismantle the systems of white supremacy and colonialism. Let's stop sitting back in our church pews and say, bless me, Lord, and no more, right? Pull yourself from your bootstrap. Individualism, right? Have no compassion over nobody else. It's just me, myself, and I, and my blessings, right? Come on, man. That's not what Christ called us for. Christ has said, have compassion, have some love, weep with those who are, mourn with those who are mourning, right? The New Testament, the Old Testament is full of justice, right? Godly justice, righteousness, love, right? Overcome evil with good, right? If you see the evil of systemic racism, systemic sin, we need to confront that, dismantle it, right? Overcome evil with good. Stop being complicit. Stop sitting on the fence. On the sidelines, denying it, and trying to say, "Oh, I'm not guilty of it. I didn't do any of that." Man, come on. You're better than that, people. Come on. So I suggest that brown and black native Christians out here, we talk about this. We bring this in the church. We teach our families and friends and all that. Let's talk about this colonialism and white supremacy and the church's involvement in all this right here. And this will actually make a change. A lot of people don't want to go to the church, especially conscious brown and black. They don't want to be involved with the churches because the churches don't confront these issues. No, don't address these issues. All they want to talk about is me, my, just their abstract spirituality in some sense. You know, they don't want to confront the real issues in society. It's just, oh, bless me, Lord, and no more. Oh, prosperity gospel, right? Or your personal sin all the time, right? Never do they want to confront the institutional sins in society, right? And there's so much to even talk about on that issue. But if you guys get a chance, get a book called Unsettling Truths by Mark Charles. He's a native Christian. He confronts the whole doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, colonialism, what happened to the indigenous people by so-called Christians, right? And there's even so much more. I mean, you got even black theologians who write on this um, topic. You got brown theologians, native theologians, right? Become aware of that. Stop listening to your white supremacist pastor who tells you, "Oh, racism doesn't exist. Oh, I shouldn't have white guilt, or there's no such thing as the white race, right? Therefore, there's no racism." I heard it all. I heard all their arguments, man. I've been there, done that. I dealt with all this nonsense, right? They bring up so many excuses and they throw all kinds of monkey wrenches at you to try to sidetrack you. But the reality is, the past affects the present. And we see the results of that, the consequences of this systemic colonial sin. Their institutions were established here, their governments were established here, their language was forced upon us. We were forced to give up our lands, right? Forced to speak their language, right? Our people were subjected to slavery, economic oppression. We were forced to work for them without even profiting from our hard work. This was even some of the Marxists talk about. I'm not a Marxist, but they have some points where they say the owners of production end up reaping the benefits of what the workers actually do, right? This is the system of capitalism. This is white supremacy. Started from slavery. And now that slavery was abolished, they still have other forms of it where they use people of color to do their dirty work, right? And usually they profit and benefit from that, right? Matter of fact, let's talk about you reap what you sow. That is a fact in the Bible, right? Now like I said, you got these white people out here saying that these white Christians either say, "Oh, I repent," and that's it, like the Pope, right? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry for the doctrine of discovery, or I have nothing to do with the doctrine of this. The church never had anything to do with the doctrine of discovery, which is nonsense. Go get that book, Unsettling Truth by Mark Charles. He goes into all that. And it's just talk, 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 talk. There's actually a good research paper. It says decolonization is not a metaphor. It goes into deep stuff and it challenges settler colonialism. And it confronted. It just talks about how a lot of these people are just all about talk, no action. They don't want to give up the land and the resources back to the native people, the brown people. None of that. They don't want to do that. They'll say they're all about our cause and justice and this and that, but They don't want to give back the wealth and resources. That's the ultimate truth there. So that's why they have to lash out and come back and say, hey, there's no such thing as racism. We're no longer racist anymore. Or I didn't do that. My ancestors did that, right? In the past, but I have no white guilt. Why should I pay for what my ancestors did to yours, right? Hey, it's all about pulling yourself from your bootstraps, right? Hey, look at me. You don't have to be a victim. Look at me. I'm making good money. Hey, I used to be poor, right? That's what white people say. Hey, I was poor. You could do the same thing, right? Man, the reality is they're here on stolen land, right? They built their empires on this stolen land. They built their governments, their corporations, their businesses. They're still benefiting from stolen land. Even if they're poor, they're still benefiting from this stolen land. Just think about that, right? Just think about that. So, the consequences of systemic sin has created the have versus the have-nots. They say, "Oh, we critical race theory causes division." It's already divided here, man. Ever since colonialism, they divided everyone. They divide and conquered. That's what they did. This is how they keep it going. They get the brown versus the brown, the black versus the brown, the native against the brown, and they confused everyone and got you even thinking that you're not indigenous, you're mestizo. They messed with your mind, got you. They created an identity for you to follow their interests. Hey, you're no longer indigenous. You're white now. Now you're a white man, right? And you're gonna fight against those natives and those immigrants and confront them, right? And say, hey, there's no such thing as racism, and we're gonna maintain our systems of oppression and act like there's no racism. We're gonna maintain our wealth and our resources and our stolen land, right? This is the technology that they pull on people. And I'm not falling for none of that. I'm confronting this right here. And the church needs to talk about this stuff. If you're a brown Christian, you need to stop falling for this deception and confront this. Confront it head on. Speak about it. Teach it. Take action. Support the native cause, the Chicano cause. Other people who are oppressed out here too. Come on, man. Let's do something about it. I've been actually fighting, ever since I've been conscious. I've been confronting, exposing white supremacy, right? Since way back, right? I've been involved in activism in the community, raising the consciousness in the community, getting people involved in learning about themselves, their history, their culture, learning about systems of white supremacy, colonialism, all that stuff. Go and do something out here. This is how you raise the consciousness. Spread the consciousness. This is what I'm all about. Spread the consciousness, man. Because the more ignorance out here, this stuff is gonna keep going, right? And we're gonna have confusion and chaos and dysfunction, all that stuff. It's because the white man has confused you, and you're ignorant of what he has done in the past and what he's currently doing. It's not something in the past, right? They're still doing a lot of things out here that are corrupt. And they're in control of a lot of stuff out here. So, anyways, so the task for white people, if you're truly following Christ, you're definitely gonna think about what your ancestors did and how you benefit from there, how you profited from it. Even if you're poor, just think about the stolen land that you're living off of. You're living on, right? Just think about it, right? Even if you're middle class, rich, just think about it. Think of how people of color in history have been affected and why a lot of them are in pretty bad conditions of poverty. Like I said, I like to do, like a lot of people deny inequalities. And you just use your common sense and look around. You're going to see, look at the Ivy Leagues. Who are the majority coming out of there, right? Look at the majority of people owning real estate, major real estate, right? Look at who controls the government, who who owns most of these corporations. And I'm not talking about few exceptions and a few tokens, right? This is their way to say that they're not racist, right? So, but just think about it. They came from Europe and they came and invaded these lands, the Americas. They wiped a lot of people off their land, enslaved them, and then they took all the resources and land and built their structures there. And then the people who survived, the native people, the brown, the black who survived, were subjugated to them. And they built up, the European colonizers built their system where they were at the top. Just read about the caste systems all throughout the colonized countries in the Americas. The European was at the top. Everyone else was below. And they dealt with everybody accordingly, right? They discriminated them. They oppressed them, right? They did a lot of shady stuff to them. And this structure still exists to this very day. It's just not as blatant as it used to be, but it still exists to this very day. And we have consequences of this systemic sin that still exists in this society. And we can't sweep it under the rug and act like it, have historic amnesia, right? We can't say, oh, no, no, hey, I didn't do any of that. Guess what? People of color natives have to go back to their reservations, right? Brown people have to go back to their low income barrios, right? Black people have to go back to their ghettos, right? Well, you live in your suburbs up there in some fancy house with your white picket fence and nice family and good job, right? You live in your mansions, nice fancy cars, your fancy jets and all that. Come on, man. You ain't fooling nobody, not this Conscious Chicano. I know too much history. I study too much of this stuff. I know too much to even be quiet about this. That's why I'm here sharing this information. And I'm confronting not only European descendants, but you European Christians, European descendants, right? Because they don't like the word white. They say, oh, there's no such thing as white, right? Okay, then I'll say European descendants, right? Who came and colonized the Americas, right? And that gets, I caught on to you, right? Your little technology, right? Anyways, but if you're a true follower of Christ, you're gonna follow justice. And definitely people reap what they sow. You can ask for forgiveness, but there's consequences. There's earthly consequences. You reap what you sow, right? And you wonder why there's people of color that don't like you, right? Sometimes they hate you, right? And then you understand why natives and blacks don't like Christianity. It's because what you guys have done in the past, all these atrocities, right? And this is why they leave the churches, right? They become conscious of that. They are aware of that history. And because you refuse to even talk about this and you even deny it, right? And you justify it. This is part of the problem out here. We need true followers of Christ who believe in justice and righteousness, compassion, who are willing to say, hey, you know what? We need to bring healing back to these nations here. We need to address what happened to the Native Americans and not only in the past, but what's currently happening to this very day. And no, we're not going to come as white saviors, right? You know, the way we say at the Good Medicine Way is like you don't go as a white missionary and have a colonial relationship with the natives, right? You know, what you do is, you know, it's like you have to relate to them and see what they have gone through, right? And feel it, experience what they, even though you may even not even experience what natives have experienced all their life, right? Due to your white privilege. But try to understand and try to understand what they're actually going through. Even Chicanos, even black people, right? And relate to that. And not only that, do something about it. You know, confront the system of white supremacy. Try to stop it and you know and replace it with systems of justice instead. Dismantle that colonialism, that white supremacy. You know, that's what needs to be done, right? So, you know, and let the natives express themselves in their own way. You don't come and tell them that they can't be native, that they can't be indigenous and follow Christ. You don't tell them that they have to cut their hair, that they got to speak your language, that that they got to worship the way you want them to worship, right? You know, you don't have to do that. You know, you're not the white savior, right? The only savior is Jesus Christ, God Almighty, right? Not the white man, right? So just remember that. And just remember that your privilege on stolen land. Just remember that. But the challenge is for Christians in general, not only white Christians, but even people of color who are Christians, to talk about this, to learn about this, study about this. What's even happening now? What is happening to this very day? You know, and so, and we gotta promote justice and truth and wisdom, compassion, love, overcome evil with good, right? And it's just not individual, right? It does involve the individual, but it's systemically too, as well. Anyways, well, if you ever guys get a chance, get yourself some books, man. There's a lot of books. I just mentioned it. Unsettling Truths by Mark Charles, Brown Church by Dr. Robert Romero. Um, you know, there's so many other books like that. You know, go get your hands on a free I think it's free book online. It's called Settlers. Look that up. Um, that's a really good one. It confronts the whole issue. It confronts the whole issue that, you know, a lot of times people say, well, Or what about poor white people? So it confronts that whole issue. And actually, go Google a paper called what is it called? Decolonization is not a metaphor. Google that. Read that whole article. Um, and it addresses the whole settler colonialism right there. And if you really want to dig down deep and learn about what if you're white and you're Christian and you're listening to this, go get yourself a book called American Holocaust by David E. Standen. Go learn about what your ancestors did and what is currently happening to this very day, the legacy of colonialism and white supremacy. So it's not a thing of the past, but it's still happening to this very day. Anyways, well, I guess I'm going to end it here. Um, and if you can, read the description below if you want to get a hold of me. Click on my Rumble account, click on my Instagram. You can send me a message if you want some more resources and all that, books and just lectures on this subject. Also, click on my Twitter as well. And definitely. Well, I'm going to let you guys go. Have a good day. And remember, don't be woke, be conscious.